I just started it.
Okay.
Brian.
Right.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the meeting for Subcommittee 2, Task 4B Identification and Evaluation of Potential FMPs. The time is 3:05 p.m., November 15th. Approval of the minutes, if there's any questions or revisions to minutes. Anybody?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? Or any opposed? I hear nothing, so the motion's approved. Okay. Updates?
So we can, I think this time I'll let Chris, do you want me to identify all the subcommittee members who are present, or did you want to do that in your slide, Chris? What would you prefer?
You can go ahead. We can just, I don't know, Jeff, if you want to share that, your screen with the third slide up, just so we can see it visually.
Okay, so for our subcommittee members that are present today at today's meeting for Subcommittee 2, I have Chairman Martinez for the Flood Planning Group, Gilbert Saldana, representing counties, Jeff Bennett, representing environmental interests, Javier Acosta, representing municipalities, Paul, representing the public, Isela Danino, representing water utilities, Levi Bryant, representing water utilities, and then part of AECOM is going to be Jeff Irvin, Brian Blaisdell, and Chris Wright. And then we also have Dr. Bora with IBWC. Is there anyone else on the meeting that I did not mention? Okay.
Do you need to mention Gonzalo Cedillos or no?
Yes, and Gonzalo Cedillos will be serving as Isela Danino's proxy. Oh, and then I also see Enrique Ochoa present. Okay, so I'll go ahead and turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Ned. The next objective, subcommittee for the presentations. So I'm going to turn this to Jeff Irvin.
Chris, you want to cover the agenda? You want me to cover the agenda?
You can go ahead and cover it, Jeff.
All right, so what we're going to be doing today is we're basically going to be going over the process for selection of FMPs, potentially feasible FMPs that will undergo technical evaluation. We went over in the last meeting, and I'm not going to go over this in any great detail, but every project that goes into the next phase of planning has to have a list of requirements defined per TWDB guidelines. And for that reason, because of the work that's involved in developing that information per TWDB guidelines, we basically need to be cutting back some of the longer lists of projects that are out there, which include the projects from the city and the projects from the county of El Paso. So we went over at the last meeting, and I'll go over it briefly, how we decided to deal with the city and the county. But our main business today is how do we deal with all the projects that are not included in a stormwater master plan, which is basically, we haven't identified any stormwater master plans other than the city and county of El Paso. So how do we deal with all those other projects and evaluate whether we carry them forward or not in this particular round of the planning? So at the end of the day today, we're going to try to develop a process for developing how we're going to score and rank all the other projects in the region. So we have a definite goal to achieve in this hour and a half that we're going to be together here. So let's start off just reviewing the last meeting. We went over the city of El Paso Stormwater Master Plan. We voted to consider the list of city projects, and we reviewed their method for scoring and prioritizing projects. And you basically accepted their method for scoring and prioritizing, with one caveat that the scoring should be reviewed to account for disruption of communities in the vicinity of the project by the construction. So we're going to go back and look at the factors that were done for those projects before, make one pass through and make an adjustment on whether we think they're going to be problematic to the neighborhoods in which they're being constructed. We also looked at the El Paso County Stormwater Master Plan, and we voted to consider the list of county projects with their method for scoring and prioritizing projects. And the county projects had a bit more detail associated with their evaluation. They actually had cost-benefit analyses done for them, and you all basically decided to keep their scoring and prioritization method for looking at those projects and deciding which ones we carry forward. So these two we're pretty far along, and there are 96 projects for the city, and there's something like 70 projects, 67 projects for the county that we've already got a process that we can write up in a tech memo to the TWDB and how we're going to address them. So let's just review what those processes were. And let's look at how the city of El Paso did their projects, because they didn't involve a cost-benefit analysis, provide a fairly rapid way to screen projects that are in the formulation phase. So I'm thinking in terms of our starting point for where we develop a method for evaluating other projects within the region, that we at least consider how the city of El Paso did it, because again, it's a fairly rapid way to screen. And remember, we're not going to use a rapid method with the ones that we identify. That's going to be done through a formal process the TWDB is defining, but we have to get down to a smaller list out of these projects from elsewhere in the region. So in the city of El Paso evaluation, they defined 8 categories of benefits, and then they gave plus or minus scores based upon how permits would affect the feasibility of doing the project. And the benefits that they defined were, and we'll look at these again in more detail later, but they had these 8 categories of benefits, and each one was assigned a point total. And then they had a bunch of stakeholders in the room, and they defined which permits were likely to be required for each of these projects. And the projects were penalized or helped based upon how complex the permits were for the projects. Let's talk, and then for the county, I'm not going to go over this in any great detail, but the county had a 2-stage prioritization where they had a set of parameters that they evaluated, and they made a first cut based upon those parameters, and then they added the benefit cost ratio later and sorted within the first division. So the stage 1 criteria scoring system for the county, they developed a scoring system for each one of these categories. And I'm not going to repeat these at this point. And then they divided their projects into a tier 1 and a tier 2 based upon the stage 1. And then they added the cost benefit and sorted within those 2 tiers. Now, we want to as part of the process that we've undergone already within the planning process, we've identified a number of projects from other sources, including several from the US IBWC, which are basically sediment basins to control sediment inflows into the river Rio Grande near Presidio, and then a whole series of levee improvements, which are in different stages of design and construction throughout the levees within our region. EPC WID1 has a number of projects which include improvements to Arroyo to help their maintenance, drain improvements to help the capacity of their drains, sending stormwater to the Rio Grande. And they also have a new regulating reservoir that's not there for handling stormwater, but which has some tributary benefits to flood control. The Corps of Engineers has has several projects that would enter our list, to include a drainage plan for updating the infrastructure needed for the Sabata watershed in central El Paso. TxDOT has at least 4 relevant projects. And then from this region-wide survey that we sent out, we have at least 4 relevant projects from different counties within the region. And we know there's at least one project the EP Water has that has water supply benefits that will also have tributary flood benefits. So we have a whole slew of projects here that we're going to have to stick all these in a list and then figure out if we're going to do technical evaluation of all these projects or cut some of these projects out when we go into the next phase of planning. So this is what you all voted on at the last meeting from our November 4th meeting. And we basically divided the group of entities with flood mitigation projects into 2 categories. One is if the project was included in a prioritized list of projects that underwent a public evaluation process, we'd follow the same process as resolved for the city and county of El Paso. We would address all the projects in the list together. We'd modify the ranking system, and we choose an option for selecting which projects undergo further evaluation by looking at how the revised point totals turn out. So if, for instance, as part of this process, we find out that a city within the region outside of El Paso had a stormwater master plan, this would be the process we'd use. If it's not part of a prioritized list, and that would include all those projects I just went over from the IBWC and the outside counties and EPC WID1 and so on, then we would take all those, put them together in one regional list, and we'd use factors and scoring per a method to be developed by you all, the subcommittee, in this meeting today. And then based upon that scoring method, you then create the scores and then find some cutoff score, which would let projects go into the next level of evaluation. Now, for the rest of this meeting, I'm going to attempt to lead you through a process to develop this scoring method. But before I start, I've been moving at a fairly rapid rate here. I want to stop and take a pause and see if anybody wants to ask about what I just presented. Nope. All right, well, we'll proceed. So we've been thinking about, again, starting off with the City of El Paso method, but we want to make sure that we're considering some of the methods that have been developed by other regions. So one of the regions that we've reviewed that had some ideas that we thought were worth discussing was the Nueces River Regional Flood Planning Group. They created a table for scoring regional needs. This isn't a table for screening projects, it's just a table for identifying regional needs. But they had a series of factors in here which are required by the TWDB to assemble as part of this planning process. And some of these we think you might consider as data you might use in the screening process for these other projects from other entities. One of the four that I think are worth looking at, because we already have assembled databases for them as part of this planning process, are low water crossings that are in the 100-year floodplain, buildings that are in the floodplain, vulnerable buildings in the floodplain. And Brian, I'm giving you a little bit of warning. I'm going to prompt you when I get to the vulnerable building slide to give a brief overview of what a vulnerable building is. Then if there's critical facilities in the 100-year floodplain, that could be something that could be relatively easily scored because we already have them in a database. So let's go through these four items and the data that we've already assembled for this plan and talk about what we already have. So let's start off with the low water crossings. So we're going to have four of these figures. On each one of them, it's going to have a close-up on the left figure of the county of El Paso, and on the right figure, it's going to have a zooming out to look at the entire flood planning region. And within the city of El Paso, we have an interior drainage 1% AC floodplain, meaning the 100-year floodplain, that's associated with what happens when there's rainfall and the river is flowing at a certain level. How does flooding occur towards the levees? And then there's the recent preliminary 100-year floodplain, 1% AC floodplain that's been published for the city and county of El Paso. And then we see notes where there are low water crossings within that region, not very many low water crossings identified by the TWDB in that region. You can see within the broader region, there's a series of low water crossings that exist across the region within the 100-year floodplain, and they're shown on this map. But the point is, if there's a project that's going to take out a floodplain, one of the things we could do is count up low water crossings that are helped out. Of more obvious use are the buildings or structures that exist within a 100-year floodplain. And you can see on the left-hand figure, there's a large number of structures in the city and county of El Paso floodplain. And you can see there's some areas of concentration throughout the region where there's multiple buildings within the floodplain. So this table on the right is of interest. Can you all read the table on the right, or do I need to blow it up a bit?
I can read it.
Okay, all right. So not surprisingly, the entity with the largest number of buildings in the 100-year floodplain is the city of El Paso, which has 9,000 structures in the 100-year floodplain. A lot of those are associated with this 100-year floodplain along the river, which, because some of the levees have not been certified, there's a large number of houses adjacent to the river that are in the floodplain, because per FEMA guidance, we have to assume the levees aren't there. So a lot of those buildings will go out of the floodplain if the US IBWC projects are completed that enable certification of the levees. But there's also 2,000 buildings within the city of Socorro. There's 1,000 buildings within the city of Alpine. There's 671 within Presidio, 501 within Sonora. So there's large numbers of structures in other municipalities within the region that are at risk. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that El Paso and Socorro are based upon recent models with recent high definition topography and recent hydrologic models. Most of these other entities within the region are not modeled in that way. They're modeled using approximate methods. And so I wouldn't consider that the 1,200 buildings in Alpine to be an accurate, refined estimate of what the risk is within the city of Alpine. But one of the questions I'd like to just throw out right now, and we may talk about it later on in the meeting, is what do we do as a planning group when we identify cities with a lot of risk but no identified FMP, no identified. So, for instance, with the city of Alpine, as far as I know, there's nobody currently paying attention to this plan actively that's associated with the city of Alpine. How do we deal with that? Anybody have any suggestions?
I had asked the environmental services coordinator for Alpine to fill out the survey. That's my home, that's where I live. But the thing that concerns me is not so much as a lack of projects, but the fact that there is no zoning or effort to think about new buildings that cover up a lot completely with impervious asphalt or roof material. I mean, that's just, the city is filling in. So I don't know if there's a way to maybe a project is just, maybe this is incorrect, but maybe a project could be just to get some of these towns to start thinking about their own internal zoning.
All right, so what I want you to think about is that our options are not just to do an FMP. Our options include doing an FMS and also a flood management strategy, and also to do a flood management evaluation. So you might think about whether we include somewhere within this flood planning process, once we identify numbers like these associated with a municipality, whether there's some combination of strategies, refined study, and projects, if it's possible to identify them, because it may be these cities have projects that we just don't know about at this point, right? But let's think about that when we get to the end here and we talk about evaluating projects outside of El Paso County and the city of El Paso, what we might do to address some of these risks that currently have no active sponsors within the region that are addressing them, right?
Gisela, did you have a question?
She's coming back.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. No, my question was in reference to the previous slide, Jeff. So you're saying that some of these, well, El Paso and Socorro, we're following the study that FEMA did, right? But I thought Clint was also part of the region that FEMA looked at. Or
Yes.
they stopped short of it. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the city and county of El Paso are all consistent with the FEMA risk. Both
Okay.
of them. Okay.
All right. Yeah, that was my only question that I had. Okay, I have to step out. I'll be back shortly. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Jeff, can I also add something real quick on the previous slide? This is for those who joined last week's Subcommittee 1 meeting. Just wanted to mention that these structure counts on the right have been revised since that meeting. We made the revision late last week, just following that meeting, and we'll be issuing some corrections in the meeting minutes to that meeting from Thursday. Just wanted to point out that you may notice a difference between those numbers, but we have revised those. And we just wanted to also emphasize that since there are a number of different methods that we can use to estimate potential buildings impacted, we may continue to revise the numbers up until the draft RFP is issued, as we continue to refine the exposure analysis and the project benefits. So we just wanted to mention that there.
All right. So as Brian points out, we have this red text up here that says preliminary data subject to change. So it will definitely change because of the fact that we're actively working on these numbers as we speak. So another data set that's out there is buildings in the floodplain with high vulnerability. Brian, can you give us just a brief description of what makes a building vulnerable per the definition?
Sure. Before that, I see Gilbert Saldana has a question, maybe.
Yes, thanks, Brian. I had a question. I know I saw that list on the previous slide, and it's specific to cities. Is that intentional, or is there going to be also a list that's incorporating unincorporated areas? Not just the city.
That's a great point. But certainly there are some unincorporated areas, for instance, in Hudspeth County along the river terraces, and you're aware of obviously the ones that are within the El Paso County, but those areas we're going to have to think about how that works. And I think I had this table put together because it was easy to plop down an incorporated area, which we have a shapefile for, and get these totals. But we're going to have to look along, particularly along the river, where there's anywhere we have a high concentration of dots within the floodplain. We're going to have to look at it and see if it's an unincorporated area that has a significant concentration of buildings at risk. So this was just a first cut.
Community of Fort Davis will fall into that second category for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but you can see that you can't really tell how many buildings are in here based upon these number of dots, because there's 9,000 dots in the city of El Paso there. So you can't see those, and Alpine is 1,200. You can't really see 1,200 dots where Alpine is either, right? So there'll have to be some focus on risk as part of our current risk task.
Okay. And then one last thing I wanted to add was I don't see the city of San Elizario on this list, and I'm going to assume that there's several buildings in their floodplain. So I don't know if you guys want to take a look at that as well.
Okay, will you add that to something to make sure is that the incorporated area of San Elizario is in our database, Chris?
Yeah, I will.
All right.
Thank you.
Hey, Jeff, before you go on, is there any differentiation between interior drainage and levee issues?
All right, so yes. So
I think that's a pretty significant difference.
What we're showing there is that the interior, the preliminary 1% floodplain includes what's called the Natural Valley floodplain. You may recall that from a different discussion we had in another meeting. But where there's no levee, there's a floodplain that includes the river, right? Includes the flooding directly from the Rio Grande into the city. In the interior drainage, the way the modeling was done is the river was set at the normal flood level, and then we put rainfall on the city, and then we saw what happened adjacent to the river on the levee side, given the existing capacities to drain into the river and the existing pump station capacities. That then defined the extent of the flooding on the interior side of the river. That area adjacent to the river overlapped with the area that's associated with the Natural Valley floodplain. So what's going to happen here is that if we certify the levees, that's going to solve the problem of flooding coming from the river into the city, but it's not going to solve the interior drainage problem, which is the problem from the mountainside or the mesa side going to the river. So the interior, we're not going to solve all the problems adjacent to the river with the levee certification. We're only going to solve the parts where there's no interior drainage flooding and Natural Valley floodplain flooding. Does that make sense? Do I need to go through that more slowly, or is that sufficient?
I just kind of, when I look at the map, it just seems to me that an awful lot of the red dots on the map are well away from the river and are caused by interior drainage flooding. It has nothing to do with the river. So I just wonder if those are going to be addressed in some other manner or evaluated in the same process.
Yes. So the FMPs within the city and county of El Paso, they've already had a planning process as part of their stormwater master plans. And they identified where their problems were. And then through a structured process, projects were identified which address the major problems. So almost all of these brown dots that you see within El Paso will be addressed by the stormwater master plans of the city of El Paso and the county of El Paso. These have been recognized and have been studied, and solutions have been developed to address these dots. So when you all vet the projects that are in the city master plan and the county master plan, you're basically vetting that these dots are being addressed in a thorough manner by those two plans. Does that answer the question? We don't.
Yeah, I hear you. I just wonder, when I look at the entire picture of the region, I wonder how many of those red dots are not associated with a river, but they're also associated with extremely flat terrain that has, strong risk of interior drainage issues with a 1% flood.
The other ones, there's no interior drainage mapping done elsewhere within the region. It's only along the Rio Grande in El Paso. So we don't have the interior drainage issue anywhere else within the district. Now that said, there's the FEMA, the maps that we're using in the broader, larger flood planning region, those are 2D maps. Those are maps that are not just flooding along and adjacent to defined channels. If there's a flat area that where water can accumulate and spread out, that area will be found by the 2D modeling, the two-dimensional modeling that's being done throughout the rest of this region. But as we said before, that 2D modeling is pretty coarse. It's not a detailed model that includes, for instance, bridge structures or anything else as part of the modeling. It's a very coarse model that considers really only terrain and rainfall. Can I go on to the next slide? Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so back to you, Brian. You want to explain about vulnerable structures?
Sure. In this context, as Jeff was mentioning, vulnerability can be one of the ways that we try to identify particular projects and score within that scoring system that he presented a few slides ago. So in this context, vulnerability is measured using the Social Vulnerability Index that was developed by the CDC. There are numerous factors that are packed into those indicators, and each the SVI, Social Vulnerability Index, is a number that's given to each tract throughout the country. So within our region, we have SVI numbers distributed throughout the region at the tract level, and it includes things like socioeconomic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, language, housing, transportation. So those are sort of all the different components that go into developing the index. The higher number indicates a higher vulnerability. And ultimately, the data are compiled from the American Community Survey at a 5-year during a 5-year interval to collect all those different aspects that I just mentioned.
And vulnerability is part of the ranking process statewide of FMPs, right? Brian?
It is part of the deliverable that will be used that will be provided with the projects, and then it will be used to rank the projects, but not necessarily to prioritize them.
Right.
That's my understanding.
All right, next one. So this map looks very similar to the map that we saw before. It's just been, the number of buildings has been winnowed down to address primarily high SVI. So looking, the TWDB also provided us a database of the locations of fire stations and hospitals and schools, and where any of those showed up within a region, within a floodplain, they also pop up within the map. So let's talk about what we do if we had to evaluate this list of projects outside of El Paso or outside of the stormwater master plans. If we were to use the El Paso water method for scoring the projects, how would we score these different levels of project benefits? I'm going to go through these one by one, because later on we're going to vote on whether to keep the category, and then we're going to talk about we aren't going to come up with points in today's meeting, but we're going to approve whether we want to keep this category in the scoring of projects that are outside the two stormwater master plans. One is if it involves a dam or dam safety, it would get 4 points. So if it involves an existing regulated dam, it would get those points. There's a number of projects within Hudspeth County, for instance, where they have flood control structures adjacent to the river that may end up being projects. They would be given 4 points for that because they were dams and had heightened risk associated with that. If the project reduces flooding of real property, you would get some number of points, and you can scale that. If it reduces flooding along the interstate, and we could add into that other critical routes within the region, then it gets 4 points or gets some number of points. If it reduces 100 plus properties from the flood zone, and this would be judgmental at this stage, but if it were designed, for instance, to take a large proportion of the city of Alpine out of the floodplain, it would get this, and it took 100 plus properties out of the floodplain in the judgment of your technical staff, then we would say, yes, it does, and you'd score them with some number of points. If it's associated with risk associated with debris flow, we had discussions how in another meeting about how the debris flows, sediment flows that occurred in 2006 came down out of the Franklins and blocked culverts and channels and bridges leading down to the river from the Franklins. We would give points to a project if it were associated, if it were a detention basin and the watershed included an arroyo, then it would get some bonus points for not only controlling water, but also controlling sediment. And it would also get points for the same reason for reducing maintenance, since one of the larger maintenance tasks associated with flooding in the region is dealing with sediment flows. Reduced flooding of major arterial roadways, we defined some category of state highway, or we could use a traffic count to define major roadways, and if the project reduced flooding at one of those roadways, then it would get an additional bonus point. These other three, which we could potentially take from the table that we saw from the Nuisance flood planning group, we would be able to quantify low water crossings in the floodplain, and you could give a range of points associated with those totals. Vulnerable, if it reduced vulnerable buildings in the floodplain and critical buildings in the floodplain, and also obviously, although we already have the properties from the flood zone up here, so this would include the format information from the 4 maps that we've discussed before. So I guess the first question is, do we, and I'm just throwing this out as a proposal, whether this is something you all might consider as a basis. Remember, we're not going to set the points today, but whether these set of parameters, these categories, are ones that we might consider for evaluation of these projects from the IBWC, EPC, WID1, etc., the counties outside of El Paso County. Do these look like a reasonable basis to use for screening? Not for prioritizing at the end, but these are things that we can do fairly quickly as part of a screening process. Does this look reasonable or not? Which ones would we take out? Which ones would we add in? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Jeff,
Are we making
to me what nuisance flooding is. Other than that, all the other categories look great to me.
So nuisance flooding is in there because El Paso has a number of projects city of El Paso has a number of projects which are basically designed to take water off the streets and put it in a storm drain. Which help individual neighborhoods within the city of El Paso. I'm not sure, it's your judgment, but whether that constitutes a regional project which would be considered by the flood planning group or not. But that one would be, it would be a bonus 2 points if it helped for some reason taking water off the streets and helping routine traffic through a city. Most of these are dealing with the 100-year. Most of these are dealing with the 100-year flood. This one's dealing with fairly routine rainfall that blocks streets.
It was Gonzalo Cedillos, right? That's the alternate for Gisela?
Yes.
Sure. Can you give us your input on this? Why was this selected, and would you like to keep it as part of this plan?
The reduced nuisance flooding?
Yes, please.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, last Thursday we were, and Enrique Ochoa can echo on this. Most of when we have in the flatlands closely by the valleys, upper or lower valleys, we just have a lot of street puddlings and pools that we have to attend because that's our responsibility. So that creates, in a single event, we can get up to 30 or 40 calls for a single event, and obviously it takes us from 2 to 4 hours for each site to be extracted and then pour that in the drains. So that creates a tremendous cost for us, and obviously that impacts the fee. So that was important for the city more, and basically to maintain what we rain is kind of a reduce the maintenance or the response in our end. And mostly this happens even on your 10 or 15-year storms. So that's the thought, or that's the reason that we kept it there.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is Dave. That's exactly what I'm talking about when I'm asking about interior flooding.
So do we can attach the score to it later. I think what we're trying to do today is make a decision on whether we consider that category of flooding in our planning. And what I'm hearing so far is that we do want to consider it because of the costs associated with maintenance and public opinion. Is that what I'm hearing? Or do we retain that particular category or not?
I
think Levi had a question too.
Levi, do you have a question?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with, reducing nuisance flooding. I think the three others, the low water crossings and the critical buildings and floodplains, they need to be in there because they're goals that we've set in Subcommittee 1. Are any of those other goals that we've set in Subcommittee 1 pertinent to being, project benefits that should be evaluated when considering these projects?
Brian, I think you're our expert on Subcommittee 1. I think the rest of these likely address your goals. You want to address that, or can you address that at this time?
I mean, I think Levi's right that a lot of these do pertain to those goals from our Subcommittee 1. I'd have to do a more detailed comparison to speak more
authoritatively.
Yeah, authoritatively, but.
So, for instance, if and I could be mixing up some of the definitions here, but
Should have
if one of the projects was funding for implementing region-wide flood warning systems, that's a structural project, but that's a project that's, working towards completing our goals for the region. Low water crossings and, critical buildings in the floodplain are absolutely one of the goals that we set short-term and long-term for goals, but I'm trying to look over some of the others and see if we can incorporate that, or if they hit some of those marks, like for instance, do those projects consider and incorporate nature-based practices and flood risk reduction projects?
So I think all those are good ideas. I think we have to keep in mind that what we're trying to do today is find an expeditious way to get a large list of projects through a starting gate. And then when we winnow the ones that we do technical evaluations for, we'll do things like identify where there's nature-based solutions. And they'll come into the technical evaluation and ranking of the projects that get through the starting gate. I think what we're trying to do today is find a way to, in a publicly vetted way, to winnow down the projects that are out there currently. And it's just at this point, I don't think we can evaluate them from a nature-based standpoint at this screening level. Now, that said, if there were one that was particularly focused on nature-based solutions, maybe we need to add, where this comes into is in the next one, where we have this permitting, right? If we have benefits, let's discuss that when we get to the next slide.
Okay. Otherwise, I don't have a problem with that list. I just want to make sure that our project evaluation process is conducive to our goals that we've set in our region. As long as those are linked somewhere in this process, I'm okay with them.
Yep, I think they're linked.
Is that list of goals available? I don't know that I've seen that. I'd like to see it.
We're finalizing the official public notice that will be posted later this evening or tomorrow morning. There will be 2 weeks public comment period before it comes to the RFPG for adoption later this month on November 30th. But if you want to look at it today before it's posted in that format, you can also look at the presentation from last Thursday's Subcommittee 1 meeting that's posted already on the website.
Thank you.
Sure.
So can I proceed? Can I proceed that this is the set of categories that the Regional Flood Planning Group wants to consider in evaluating which from the total universe of flood management projects, which one we're going to call potentially feasible and carry into the next phase?
Based on Levi's comment, if there's any goal that is overlooked, I suggest that might be added into this list.
I concur, Mr. Gonzalo.
All right, so we'll add in with the caveat that this list be reviewed against the goals and categories added in future meetings.
Yes.
Okay, that's a good comment.
A motion or no?
All right, on to the next slide. All right, so the way they did it with the city of El Paso evaluation is they quantified benefits and scored the benefits. Then they wanted to make sure that they wanted to differentiate projects on on whether they could actually get through a permit process and the length of time and effort it would take and feasibility of getting the permits done. And these permits were scored for each project based on what appeared to be their difficulty in obtaining the permit. So, Levi, what I'm thinking is that if in the judgment of the committee, you could change the score to where we have an easy +2 value if it had positive nature-based solutions associated with it. We could add another higher value to make it have positive numbers in this case. And then when you got down to environmental impacts, you could give it a boost based upon having that particular benefit. If it had benefits in terms of preserving archaeologic remains or whatever, then we could do the same sort of thing.
I like that comment.
So I think the way this would work is we go through the projects and we say, this one involves a railroad, that's going to be hard to get. We give it a score. If it does or does not include an IBWC permit, it gets a score. If it requires a TCEQ permit, be it from dam safety or whatever, it gets some score. And you just basically run down this list for each project and check off the ones that pertain. And what we're going to do is we're going to add, per Levi's comment, we're going to add an easy +2 to where it actually shows a benefit because of the positive nature of the impacts as opposed to the negative. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right, so let's try to make a first cut if we can on the number of points, and we'll divide this. What's the relative weight of each of these categories, and are we going to allow a sliding scale of the number of points associated with each category? This is all largely judgment. It looks like in the way that the city did it, they thought that dam safety, reduced flooding of real property, the added bonus associated with getting water off of I-10, the added bonus of getting water off of a major arterial roadway, reducing maintenance, they were all roughly equivalent. The nuisance flooding was of somewhat reduced importance. Debris flow was of reduced importance. And they were basically just a bonus on top of anything else if there were debris flow or if there's a large number of properties. So if you had 100 properties removed from the flood zone, you'd get 7 points because you'd reduce flooding of real property, which was 4, and then you get 3 for having over 100. Does anybody want to start a conversation on what type of relative weighting is between these factors?
Okay.
This is Dave. I think because of public awareness that nuisance flooding is just as important to the individuals that live near flooded roads as major arterial roadways or real property or whatever. So I think 2's not enough for that if we're paying attention to impact on the public.
All right. Any comment on that?
But are we comparing the benefit of reducing nuisance flow to removing structures from the floodplain? Because if they're relative, if the street has water, 6 inches of water in it, but your house is fine, I don't know if I'd want to rank that as high as removing 5 houses from the floodplain. Is that the relative here that we're talking about, or?
How do we define nuisance flooding?
So let me just keep in mind what we're doing here. We're gonna run through the projects, and we're gonna say, does this include dam safety? Yes or no? And this one is really an all or none, so it's an all. Then we're going to say, does it reduce flooding of real property? Almost all projects are going to have that. Although it's possible to have a project that doesn't affect real property and has some other purpose. For instance, a early warning system wouldn't reduce flooding of real property, right? But this would be, if you reduce flooding, you're going to get 4 points. This one is like an reduced flooding of IH10 is that it's added, and you get the total points as it's added. So you add 4 to whatever the total is, right? Because of the importance of keeping water off of I-10. If you remove 100 plus properties from the flood zone, that's in addition to reducing real property, but let's say it's 30 properties. But if you get up to 100, which is a sort of a threshold, then you would add 3 more to the total. So if a project took water off of I-10, reduced real property, took 100 properties from the flood zone, it would already be getting 11 points. If it's on an arroyo such that it controls sediment, then it's going to get an added. The way I'm doing it now, you would add 4, and so on. So these, it's not nuisance flooding or something else, it's nuisance flooding and whatever else. If it reduces maintenance and reduces nuisance flooding, then it gets however many points for those 2 together.
It seems to me, just back to nuisance flooding again, that many of the lower areas in this region, especially in the lower valley, where a street floods, it's also flooding homes because the homes aren't elevated above street level. So there are many circumstances, especially in the last rain that we had, where just because the street flooded, there were many homes that had a foot of water inside of them that did major damage. So that's why I'm really paying attention to that.
That doesn't sound like nuisance flooding to me. I mean, that sounds like real flooding. So that's why I'm getting like, how do we define nuisance flooding?
Yeah, I was defining nuisance flooding as something where you have a routine rainstorm and it gets into this, because there's no storm drain, it floods out the street. So for almost any storm event, you have traffic restricted. If it's getting into the houses, then it's obviously within the 100-year floodplain, so it qualifies under the other title, is the way I would define that.
That's correct, Jeff. Nuisance flooding is precisely just the ability of the people to leave their homes, which they're mostly raised. And I've noticed that in a lot of the subdivisions in the valley, you will see some of these homes built about 3 feet or a meter above the finished elevation at the time. And I'm talking back in the 20s. So most of these homes, you will step up to the finished floor. Obviously, not all of them were built that way. And obviously, water did flood those properties. But for most of those subdivisions or their neighborhoods, they would rain and water will be standing on the streets and they would be impeded to go out and, and mobility to access the streets and go whatever their business in the following days. So that water needed to be extracted, lowered, and then so they can basically go back to normality. That's what nuisance flooding was to us. So how you stated it, Jeff, is correct.
And see, that's interior drainage is really what it is.
But this is the practice that was back then in the early 1900s when El Paso did not have storm drainage, other than mostly everybody knew the water get up to a meter of depth. So everybody built 3 feet or above, or a meter above the ground elevation. And you will notice this if you drive through the barrios and things like that. All of these are elevated streets. We noticed that when we built the Cebada, a lot of these homes that we bought, they were elevated.
So I'd like to get this meeting over on time at 4:30 your all's time. We can either try to define the points now, or we can defer this till the next meeting. We're going to have to write this process up, and I can just write up as part of the process we submit now that the points will be defined in a future meeting by the subcommittee. We don't have to decide this now. If we can decide today just on these categories with the qualification that we're going to review the qualifications, these categories against the goals, and adjust the list to make sure that we've covered the goals with the information that we have available now. That's got to be a criteria for this particular selection, because this isn't the final answer. This is just a quick scanning of the projects, a quick scoring of each one based upon these items, and they can't be based upon additional technical data. This can be based upon this regional data that we've already collected. Do we want to score them today, or do we want to defer it to the next meeting?
Hey, Jeff, this is Gilbert. I propose that we just leave it for the next meeting, because I don't agree. I mean, I understand and agree with Levi as far as the weight on some of these things. I understand nuisances should definitely be considered, but I just don't seem to agree with weighing them the same. I don't know. That's my suggestion.
All right, so we'll go ahead and as part of the minutes, and you all have we'll try to send out an email with this table to everybody that's in the meeting. I think you all had this table in the notice of the slides we're going to present. But let's come to the next meeting having some proposals on how to do this weighting, and have some discussion at the next meeting. So potential committee actions, votes on the process for selecting potentially feasible projects for projects other than the stormwater master plans. We'll have scoring categories per the list on the revised slide. So it'd be the scoring categories per this. Point score per decision made in the next meeting. And then we would have a subcommittee workshop after we came up with this scoring scheme, and we'd run through these projects that we discussed before, the IBWC projects, the EPC, WID projects, etc. We'd score them in a subcommittee workshop. And then we would sort the projects by score, and then based upon the subcommittee discussion, we'd decide which of that list we'd actually carried forward into technical evaluation. Does that sound like a process we can publish? Does anybody want to make a revision to what I've written here? If not, if somebody could propose that we go ahead and put this procedure in the memo that we have to get out tonight.
Do we have to make a motion?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to make a motion at this point.
So moved. This is Omar.
Second.
Levi Bryan.
All in favor? Say
Aye.
aye. Any opposed? Motion passes.
All right, so we'll write up this process in the memo that's going to go out. Now, Chris, I'm going to pass it back to you for this.
Okay.
For the tentative future
meetings. All right. So we haven't sent out a doodle poll for the next meeting in the subcommittee. It sounds like it would be good to have this one sooner rather than later. I know for subcommittee 3, we talked about not having the next meeting until after January 7th, when the official or final version of the tech memo was due. But since it would be helpful, I think, to get this scoring matrix finalized before then, so that we can make progress in the meantime. I think that it would be good to pick a date that's a week or two after we deliver the technical memorandum draft, which will be December 3rd. So I would suggest something the week between December 13th and 17th, which would be December, right now, just tentatively, I think that the 14th, which is a Tuesday, would work pretty well. But, any day that week, I think would be good, because that's a little bit, before the holidays, just barely before the holidays. And it would give us enough time to, if we need to make any last minute decisions or modifications to the tech memo before the final version is due January 7th, it would allow us to do that. Are there any comments about that week between December 13th and the 17th? Does that not work for anybody?
Just depends on the time. I mean, we're all trying to get in meetings in before the holidays, so that week's already, for me anyways, there's already at least one meeting every day. So it just depends upon the time.
I'll send
on
that,
December.
Chris.
Okay.
Do you want me to
You want to do a doodle poll?
Or do we just want to set it for the 14th and let's just all agree to a date, since there's already a majority on the call?
I can do it the 14th anytime other than first thing in the morning.
Okay, do we want to throw out there maybe the afternoon of the 14th, say 1 p.m.? We could aim for another hour-and-a-half meeting, 1 to 2:30 Mountain Time.
That works for me.
It works for me.
Okay. Let's go
Are
ahead.
we going to try to? Are we going to try, Chris? Are we going to try at the next meeting to both get the scoring points done and try to at least get started on this list of projects that we need to score?
Yeah, I think that would be a good goal.
So when do we have to have the list of potentially feasible projects submitted to the state? When does the actual list after the screening happen? Because we have to do the screening of the county projects, the screening of the city projects, and the screening of the other projects. when do they have to be, when does that list have to be finalized?
Well, it doesn't have to be finalized until, that we submit the whole draft regional flood plan, but there is a tech memo due to TWDB on January 7th, where we are supposed to provide a list of the potentially feasible FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs at this time. But if we can add to that list or change that list after the tech memo.
All right,
and at this point, yeah.
We're going to have to, it's going to take at least 2 meetings before January 7th. Either that or we have this meeting, really a long meeting on the 14th.
You gotta just start it, and when it ends, it ends.
Is there any of this that can be assigned as homework? I mean, we fill out, we send back to you, you consolidate, maybe have something a little bit farther along to vote on and discuss at a meeting instead of, start early on maybe. Like if you send us that table, we fill it out with what we think. We send it back to y'all and y'all consolidate it. Does that help at all?
That's a good idea. So what I think, that's a very good idea. Thank you, Levi. I think what we'll do is we'll send out the table and give you all basically a week to put in what you think the weight should be. And then we'll have Brian, who knows how to work the software, basically go through a process to get consensus on the scoring quickly. Meanwhile, we will we're going to have to we'll attempt for that meeting on the 14th to develop the cutoff for the city projects, the cutoff for the county projects, and at least get started on the ones from outside those 2 plans. So it may be a long meeting on the 14th is what I'm trying to prepare everybody for, if we have to have this list by the 7th.
Hey, Jeff, this is Gilbert. I just want to, I guess as I was thinking about weighing the table as Levi suggested, I'd like to be able to at least make sure that I'm thinking about it correctly on nuisance flooding. So if obviously if there's a property that's getting flooded out, just I don't know, even within in a house, I guess that would also be considered nuisance property. I mean nuisance. Or is that something that we should be thinking about, that it's only if it's a flooding problem?
All right,
like 5-year.
Let me just remember that what the projects that we're going to be scoring are the projects that have come out from outside. This is the list of projects we're going to have, right? So we're not the city and the county projects, most of which are dealing with this issue of nuisance flooding, have already been scored, and you've already basically bought into what the city and county did with that scoring before, right? What we're trying to do is get a scoring system that lets us deal with these type of projects here, and there's really no projects in this list that include storm drain improvements, which are the type of things that would be targeted specifically at nuisance flooding, right? So I don't think we need to when we start comparing the full list, and we start comparing some of these county projects and city projects that are focused on storm drains and so on, then we're going to have to consider them in comparing the whole suite of them. But I think to make decisions on these, we're pretty much, I'm not sure it's not going to be a major factor in our decision making, right? So keep that in mind when you're developing these scores, that this list is the one that we need. So I think I think, but Gilbert brings up a good point, and I think I think we need in this email, I'll try to put out a clear definition of what nuisance flooding means. I'll also put out a clear definition of what interior drainage flooding means, because I think we've had we just need to define in more detail what we mean by interior drainage. It has a specific legal meaning per FEMA that we just need to lay out. And I'll also include this list of projects that we know we have. I'll include that table, and then we'll have a deadline per Levi's suggestion of about a week to come up with a suggestion on how to score it.
And then when you do the list, you're going to absorb any goal that's not on the list.
We'll also, before we send out that email, Brian, can you look at goals and see whether, just send me a list of the goals that you're sending out today. And I'll make up a cross matrix that shows which of these parameters intersects with a goal.
Okay.
And then you'll be able to see, kind of a measles diagram that shows that we have the goal covered or we don't. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
How many goals do we have, Brian? There's a lot, right?
In total, we had between 20 and 30 goals.
Right, so it's going to be a big table. It's going to be 20 by 10. But
some of those were double counted. You had, low water crossings for short term and long term.
Yeah.
Inside and outside of certain areas.
But I think it's a good comment. We should be thorough in making that check. So I'll make that check before I send out that email. So thanks for the comment. Anything else?
Do we want to go ahead and schedule that meeting on the 14th to be a 3-hour meeting, just in case?
I did hear from Gilbert or Levi, I think, or Omar, in terms of their availability on the 14th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time.
That works for me.
Levi, is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, Omar?
Isn't there a water conference on the 14th, 15th in El Paso?
If there is.
Anybody heard that?
I don't know that.
Okay, no, I must be mistaken. I'm available.
Okay.
So Gilbert Saldana, we need to have a quick conversation at some point on the projects that are in the plan, which ones are funded, which ones should be considered by the group, and which ones are already dealt with in some fashion.
There you go.
Sir.
Okay, all right. And the same thing, Gonzalo, I think I know the answer for the city, but we need to get the ones out that are already dealt with.
Correct.
Hey, Jeff, you have a question?
Yeah, what sort of information are we going to be provided with in order to make our ratings?
You're providing the scores where you're going to fill in that table where we come up with a number of points associated.
Based upon what? Based upon this list of bullets, or are we going to see maps or?
When we get into the scoring of the projects, we will be looking at maps, and we will, as the technical, for the ones that relate to maps, like number of structures, we're going to have some judgment for each project, the relative number of structures it removes from the floodplain. We're going to have that figured out.
I mean, just thinking about sediment basins near Presidio, even if to determine whether that's even feasible, we need to understand bed load transport in the tributaries. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that I suspect haven't been done yet.
Right.
So-
So what's what we'll do is we'll have to get with the USIBWC. They have, you may recall that in the descriptions we had, I'm not sure you attended the meeting, but we had
Nope.
a description. We had a description of flooding near Presidio, and they get a large amount of sediment coming in to the Rio Grande from two different arroyos near Presidio. And so these basins on the arroyos are not there to protect houses. They're there to protect.
I understand what they're there for. Yeah, I've been working on the flooding near Presidio for a long time. I understand what they're there for. I just don't see those as being a good use of funds. I don't think they'll work. So that's what I just need to see more information other than telling me you're going to dig a big hole at the bottom of Alameda Creek to catch the sediment. That's what that sounds like to me. Maybe I'm wrong. So that's why I'm asking, is there more information about what they're proposing?
I think where that input comes into this screening level process is you speak up at the point where you talk about permitting. If you think it's going to be very difficult to permit because it's not a proven concept.
Well, so the flooding occurred from above Ojinaga all the way down to the reservoir. So Mulato, Redford, San Vicente, Boquillas, Santa Elena, Rio Grande Village, Cottonwood, they all flooded. And there were structures underwater and there were people evacuated all up and down the stream. So those two sediment basins may help the damming that was provided by the delta at the mouth of Alameda Creek, but it's not going to help anybody else.
Right.
That's what I'm getting.
Right. And I think that information will be very helpful in scoring for these categories because it'll have a certain number of people helped out of the floodplain. It'll get some points for debris control, but it's not going to get it's not going to get 100 people out of the floodplain. It's going to be difficult to permit. There are other things that'll be weighing in on that score.
I'm just suggesting it's going to be hard to rate with not a lot of information. I just don't see, maybe there'll be more information, but if we just have if it's presented to us at the next meeting, that's not enough time to really consider it. That's what I'm getting at.
So we have a way to punt. The Water Development Board has given us a way to punt. What you do is you punt and say, we don't have enough information to make a decision on this project. It kicks over to become a FME. And so you say, this is, this requires an evaluation. But
well, that's good information.
Yeah.
Because that would be my suggestion for that.
I've let you all drag on past 5:30, 4:30, sorry.
No, we need to conclude soon, just to respect people's time.
One comment on the list. It seems to me that vulnerable buildings in the floodplain actually falls within reduced flooding of real property. And if everybody thinks that one is a part of the other one, then we can actually take that vulnerable buildings in the floodplain out and include it in reduced flooding of real property. Because it's pretty generic.
That's a decision by the flood planning group. Where you get where that bit of information helps is that there are considerations in funding on whether you're taking vulnerable populations out of the floodplain. So if you have
what's the difference between vulnerable and critical then?
Critical is defined as facilities that are like fire stations and hospitals and schools, which are critical for either protecting children or responding to the flood itself, right?
Okay, what's the difference between vulnerable buildings then and real property?
So vulnerable. I'll let Brian talk again, but Brian gave the definition of it. The vulnerable is a database definition that's set by the state that states that if you have a certain sociological category, you're vulnerable. If it's low income or it's, other parameters, then you become vulnerable. It's not a matter of the straightforward definition of vulnerable.
Okay. So it's a thought.
I'll include in this email a definition of vulnerability also, so you can review it.
Okay.
Yeah, just to walk through the steps. So there's flood risk, which is where's the flood hazard area, mapped on, drawn on a map, kind of like a floodplain. Then you have flood exposure, which is how does that flood hazard area overlap with buildings. Then you have vulnerability, which is of those buildings that are exposed to flood risk, which ones are most vulnerable from a socioeconomic standpoint. Factors like household composition, race, ethnicity, language, availability of transportation, and housing types. Those are the factors that go into the vulnerability equation. So you have a subset of your buildings that are exposed to flood risk will be vulnerable. And then, like Jeff said, you'll have critical facilities, which are completely different set of buildings, which are involved in critical infrastructure, supporting different aspects of emergency response or schools or shelters.
Hey, Jeff, I guess when you put that definitions, if you can just show like examples, I think that might help as well.
Brian, can you send me that definition so I can include it in the email?
Sure.
And Ed, I think it's back to you.
All right, then I think we just have that one last item to adjourn.
Yes, if I could get a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Levi Brian.
Seconded.
Okay.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 You opposed? Motion adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Jeff and Chris, Brian, can I have you stay on after you stop the recording? I just need to ask a question real quick about the additional funding.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
My question is,
The
would you
recording
all?
is still on.
Okay.
Brian, are you able to stop that?